Hey guys, it's Linux Next here. In today's video, we are going to be showing off a brand new feature that has finally been implemented into Proton, and it is specifically for NVIDIA users. So if you've been wanting a particular feature known as DLSS Frame Gen, well, it is now merged into Proton Experimental, which is the compatibility layer for playing games on Linux. And before this video starts, definitely give it a like and definitely subscribe to the channel. I would definitely appreciate it. Now, one thing to note here about this whole video is that since I only have an RTX 2060 GPU, I can't get frame generation in actual video games. I can only get FSR3 frame generation. So this video still is showing off frame generation actually working on an NVIDIA card. It's just that I can only use FSR3. But if you have a 40 series GPU, you should be able to use DLSS frame generation. So if we do look at our screen here and we look at the changelog of Proton Experimental, which is the runner that you have to use to get the frame generation working on NVIDIA GPUs right now, as you can see here, added support for NVIDIA Optical Flow API and DLSS 3 frame generation. So if we have a look at what Optical Flow API is, it is a SDK from NVIDIA that taps into the latest hardware capabilities of NVIDIA Turing, Ampere, and ADA Arch GPUs dedicated to computing the relative motion of pixels between images. So this SDK was getting merged a couple of days ago, and people were speculating that because this is used for DLSS 3 frame generation to work, that it was going to be merged into Proton and NVIDIA cards will be able to use frame generation, and this is true. So now that it's in Proton Experimental, we can actually test out some games on my RTX 2060 GPU that I have installed. If you go to the about setting here, we are running KD Plasma Wayland with an RTX 2060. I think it has 6 gigabytes of VRAM, I think it has, and we'll be testing out some games like Cyberpunk 2077 is a great example of showing this frame generation. And also, before I start the video, if we do show the driver that I'm using, I am on Endeavor OS currently, and we are using the 565.57.01 NVIDIA driver. So if we do look at our graphics settings, we do have around, I would say, medium to low settings. I guess I'll change this to medium to low, just make it a bit more just easier when it comes to like showing off FPS and stuff. Yeah, around medium to low settings. Our settings up here, we don't have frame generation turned on right now as we want to show the normal FPS, and then we have FSR3 turned on right now, and it's just on quality. And I can't switch to DLSS with frame generation because I'll show you soon that frame generation, you can only use one frame generation right now. But if we do go into some gameplay right now to show up some footage of what the FPS looks like right now, we'll see that the FPS is rather, it's alright, 60 FPS, while OBS is taking around 5% of encoding right now on my NVIDIA card. So performance, if I stop recording, I'd probably reach like 80, maybe 75 FPS, maybe. But as you can see, it's around like 65, 63, 64, 62 in this area. So if we do enable frame gen and we do restart the game, as you have to restart the game if you want to use frame gen. And as we can see with DLSS or FSR3 frame generation turned on, we are getting around 96, 97, around that in this area, which is awesome to see. We gained, like 20 something FPS, close to 30 FPS gain, which is really good for an RTX 2060. As RTX 2060 on Cyberpunk with my Ryzen 7600 hasn't been that great when it comes to FPS. I have to put the graphics rather low settings, I would say, with like FSR3 super resolution or DLSS turned on. But as I said, we can only use FSR3 frame generation on Cyberpunk right now. So if you're like, or you actually want to use DLSS 3, even though FSR3 frame generation, it's still going through that NVIDIA's SDK, so you're still getting the similar experience you would get on Windows if you're using DLSS frame generation. Is that you have to use, at least for now on Cyberpunk, I'm seeing that you have to use Super Resolution 3 and FSR3 frame generation. If you try to switch it to DLSS Super Resolution and you try to turn on frame generation, it switches back to FSR3 frame generation. But of course, with the FSR3 on quality and FSR3 frame generation, we are getting 100 FPS, 90, 7 FPS, which is really freaking good. Now, when it comes to other games that try to use frame generation, something like Witcher 3, for example, this one doesn't seem to be actually working. It has the option here, but as you can see, it's not available to enable as it's grayed out. And when we look through graphics here, we don't seem to have an option to enable frame gen. We can still use DLSS, and we can set it to different qualities, but we don't have frame generation on The Witcher 3, at least for this one we don't. And I just made sure I switched Proton Experimental to Bleeding Edge to see if that changed anything, and it didn't, sadly. Now, another game that I like to play, not on my NVIDIA card, as we can see, the FPS without frame generation and just DLSS, we can see that the game's only running at like 27 FPS, which is very poor. And that's probably because of my OBS recording. It's taking 4.9% of my CPU right now for some reason. If we have a look through here though, we do have the frame generation option, which is FSR3 again. So if we do enable it, now we have around 46. Wow, that's like 20 more FPS. So if you're not recording on OBS and you're not taking like 5% of your CPU, you should see a performance gain when it comes to using FSR3 frame generation on something like Remnant 2. Now, there is one more game that I was going to show that does have frame generation and works with frame generation, but for some reason, this game takes all of my VRAM on my GPU that I can't start encoding on OBS Studio. It literally comes up with a CUDA error saying that I'm out of VRAM because there's just not enough for it to start the encoding. And that game is called Off the Grid. Now, it's a new Battle Royale game that I've played before, and it does run quite well on my newer AMD GPU. On my NVIDIA GPU though, I get around like 40-ish FPS on the lowest settings, and then with frame gen on, I get upwards of around like, it's like 70, close to 70, so like 50, I think it was like 40 to 50 FPS, and I go from that, which is the lowest settings, and I think I was using just FSR balanced, FSR3 balanced, and then turning frame generation on, I went to around 70 to 80 FPS with frame generation turned on. So this one does indeed work when you do use Proton Experimental. It's just I can't show footage. So what I am going to do is I'm going to try and record this with GPU screen recorder, because I bet that one's going to work basically fine. And I'll try and show footage of the frame generation off versus the frame generation on, so you can see it. So when it comes to the support of frame generation on Linux now on NVIDIA cards, it is finally here, I would say. Of course, Valve and NVIDIA, they're both going to continue working and improving on it in Proton, so they can probably get more games working. As you saw, Witcher 3, that has it disabled right now. Don't really know why it's disabled. Maybe it has an issue with frame generation specifically with that game. So hopefully they improve more games with frame generation, bring more support. So if you guys did enjoy this rather short video of showing your frame generation finally in Proton on NVIDIA cards, definitely give it a like, definitely subscribe to the channel, and of course leave the comments down below how you feel about frame generation coming to NVIDIA on Linux under Proton. I'd really like to know. And thank you to my supporters. I'll show up a screenshot now. I really do appreciate you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.